In the winter of 1887, the Wyoming Territory was as unforgiving as it was vast. Most men who rode those frozen hills carried little more than hope and a prayer. Bo Callahan carried even less, just a worn saddle, a half-starved horse, and the kind of past that follows a man like his own shadow. When the storm hit, it hit hard, turning the world white and deadly. He wasn't looking for trouble that night, just shelter from nature's fury. What he found instead was something no man should ever witness. A woman tied to an iron stove, her wrists bound tight, writhing in the final throes of childbirth. The man who'd done this was long gone, leaving her to die alone in that isolated cabin. But what kind of man leaves a laboring woman to freeze and bleed to death? And more importantly, what kind of secrets was Mara Lynn carrying that made someone want her dead? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled like a wounded animal outside the cabin walls, but Bo Callahan had heard worse sounds in his 34 years of hard living. What he'd never heard before was the kind of desperation in a woman's voice that could cut through a blizzard and straight into a man's conscience. The woman tied to the iron stove wasn't just giving birth. She was fighting for her life and the life of the child trying to enter this unforgiving world. "Easy now," Bo murmured, his calloused hands working quickly to free her wrists from the rope that had rubbed them raw and bloody. The knots were tight, cruel in their precision, telling a story of deliberate torment that made his jaw clench with familiar rage. He'd seen enough violence in his time to recognize the methodical cruelty of a man who enjoyed causing pain. Her eyes, wide with pain and terror, fixed on his face as he worked. They were the color of sage honey, those eyes, and they held an intelligence that surprised him. Most women in her condition would have been senseless with agony by now, but she was watching him, studying him, as if trying to determine whether he was salvation or just another kind of damnation. "Who are you?" she gasped between contractions, her voice hoarse from screaming into the empty night. "Name's Bo," he said, finally freeing her left wrist and moving to the right. "Bo Callahan, and right now I'm the only help you're going to get, so we best make the most of it." As her second wrist came free, she immediately cradled her swollen belly, her breathing coming in short, sharp bursts. Bo had helped birth foals and calves plenty of times, but a human child was different. Territory altogether. Still, birth was birth, and life had a way of demanding entrance into the world, regardless of circumstances. "What's your name?" he asked, helping her shift to a more comfortable position on the rough wooden floor, using his own coat as padding. Beneath her, "Mara," she whispered. "Mara Lynn Hartwell." The name came out like a confession, as if she wasn't entirely sure she had the right to claim it anymore. Bo noticed the thin gold band on her finger then, a simple wedding ring that caught the firelight from the stove. It was the only thing of value visible in the sparse cabin, and it told its own story of promises made and broken. The metal was worn smooth in places, as if she'd twisted it anxiously for months or maybe years. "Where's your husband, Mara Lynn?" The question came out harder than he'd intended, but the answer was written in the rope burns on her wrists and the fear in her eyes. "Gone," she said simply, and then another contraction seized her, cutting off any further explanation. Bo had ridden into this storm carrying nothing but his own troubles, but now he found himself responsible for 2 lives that hung in the balance. His past was littered with violence and poor choices, but he'd never walked away from someone who needed help. That moral compass had gotten him into trouble more times than he could count, but it was the one part of himself he'd never been able to abandon. No matter how much easier his life might have been without it, the cabin itself told a story of hardship and isolation. It was small, maybe 12 feet by 16, with walls of chinked logs that had seen better decades. A single window faced east, its glass cracked but intact. offering a view of nothing but endless white emptiness. The furniture was sparse and handmade: a rough table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. Everything was clean, but worn, maintained by someone who took pride in what little they had. What struck Bo most was what wasn't there. No family photographs on the walls, no decorative touches that spoke of a woman's hand making a house into a home. No children's toys or clothes. This was a place where people existed rather than lived, and the weight of that loneliness settled over the room like dust. "How long has he been gone?" Bo asked as he built up the fire in the stove, needing both warmth and light for what was coming. 3 days, Mara said, her voice steadier now. "Maybe 4. Time gets strange when you're—" She gestured vaguely at her condition, then looked away. "He said he was going to town for supplies before the baby came, said he'd be back by nightfall." But Bo could see in her eyes that she'd known he wouldn't come back. Maybe she'd hoped. The way people hope for miracles they don't really believe in. But she'd known. A man who would tie his pregnant wife to a stove and leave her to die alone wasn't the kind who made good on his promises. "The storm's been going 3 days straight," Bo said gently. "Could be he got caught in it, found shelter somewhere else." Mara's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You don't know Jacob. Weather never stopped him from doing what he wanted, and what he wanted was to be rid of me and this child." She touched her belly with a mixture of love and fear that made Bo's chest tight. He never wanted to be a father. Said a baby would just be another mouth to feed, another weakness to worry about. The contraction that hit her then was stronger than the others, and Bo could see that things were moving fast. He'd delivered enough animals to know the signs. This child was coming whether they were ready or not. "I need you to help me here, Mara Lynn," he said, moving to her side. "I know you're scared, and I know you got every reason to be, but that baby needs you to be strong right now." She nodded, gripping his hand with surprising strength. Her fingers were long and elegant despite the calluses that spoke of hard work, and when she squeezed, he could feel the determination beneath the fear. What followed was the most primal thing Bo had ever witnessed. Birth was a violent miracle, all blood and struggle and impossible hope. Mara Lynn proved herself tougher than rawhide, bearing down with each contraction like she was fighting a war, which Bo supposed she was. A war against death, against abandonment, against the kind of cruelty that would leave a woman to die alone. When the baby finally came, sliding into Bo's inexperienced but gentle hands, the silence that followed was profound. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to pause, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Then the child cried, a strong, angry sound that spoke of life, determined to persist despite everything. And Bo felt something shift inside his chest. He'd brought life into the world instead of taking it away, and the weight of that reversal settled over him like grace. "It's a girl," he said, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't expected. "A healthy baby girl." Mara Lynn's tears came then, relief and joy and exhaustion all mixed together. She reached for her daughter with shaking hands, and when Bo placed the child against her chest, something in the room changed. The cabin was still cold and sparse, the storm still raged outside, and their situation was still desperate, but there was life here now. New life, innocent and full of possibility. "Hello, little one," Mara whispered, her voice soft with wonder. "I'm your mama, and I promise, I won't let anyone hurt you." Bo cleaned up as best he could with the supplies available, using melted snow for water and strips torn from a relatively clean shirt for cloth. His movements were careful, methodical, the same attention to detail that had kept him alive through years of riding with dangerous men. "You did good," he told Mara as she nursed the baby. "Real good. She's lucky to have you for a mother." Mara looked up at him then, really looked at him for the first time since he'd arrived. "Why did you help me? You don't know me from Eve, and I got nothing to offer you in return." It was a fair question, and one Bo had been asking himself. He could have taken shelter in the barn, waited out the storm without ever knowing what. was happening in the cabin. Could have ridden on when he found her, told himself it wasn't his problem. But something in her eyes had reached past his defenses, past the walls he'd built around whatever was left of his conscience. "Maybe because I got a debt to pay," he said finally. "Maybe because I spent too many years being the kind of man who walks away from trouble instead of helping. Or maybe because some things are just right, regardless of what a man gets out of it." The truth was more complicated than that. Bo Callahan had been running from his past for the better part of 5 years, ever since the botched bank job in Colorado that had left 2 innocent people dead and his gang scattered to the winds. He'd been Black Bo then, known for his quick draw and quicker temper, a man whose reputation preceded him into every saloon and out of every town. But sitting in that cabin, watching a woman cradle her newborn daughter with fierce protectiveness, he felt like someone else entirely, someone who might be worth saving. "What's her name going to be?" he asked. Mara looked down at the baby, considering. "Hope," she said finally. "Her name is Hope." Outside, the storm continued its assault on the small cabin, but inside, 3 people, who had been strangers just hours before, were learning what it meant to be a family born of necessity and sustained by something deeper than blood. None of them knew what morning would bring, but for now they had warmth, shelter, and each other. And sometimes, Bo reflected as he settled in for what remained of the night, that was enough to build a life on. Dawn came slowly to the Wyoming territory, filtering through the cracked window of the cabin like honey through cheesecloth. The storm had finally exhausted itself during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. Bo woke to the sound of Hope's soft breathing and Mara's quiet humming, a lullaby that spoke of gentle hopes in a harsh world. But as the light grew stronger, it revealed things that the darkness and desperation of the night before had mercifully hidden. Things that made Bo's blood run cold, and his hand instinctively moved toward the gun he'd kept within reach. The rope that had bound Mara to the stove lay coiled on the floor like a snake, and in the morning light, Bo could see it more clearly. This wasn't rough hemp or the kind of cord a man might use for general ranch work. This was braided leather, soft and strong, the kind used for fine tack or for binding someone you intended to keep alive for a long time. The knots hadn't been tied in haste or anger. They were precise, methodical, designed to hold without cutting off circulation entirely. Jacob Hartwell hadn't left his wife to die quickly. He'd meant for her to suffer. Mara saw him examining the rope, and her face went carefully blank. "He was always good with knots," she said quietly, not wanting to wake the baby. Said it was important to do things properly, even when she didn't finish the sentence. But she didn't need to. Bo moved around the cabin more systematically. Now, looking at everything with the trained eye of a man who'd spent years on the wrong side of the law. What he found painted a picture of systematic cruelty that made his jaw clench with familiar rage. Scratches on the wooden floor near the stove, too regular to be accidental. Mara had been tied there before, probably many times. A collection of empty bottles hidden behind the wood box, all bearing the label of cheap whiskey. Burn marks on the wall at shoulder height, small and round, the kind a cigarette might make if held against wood or skin, but it was what he found under the loose floorboard near the bed that truly revealed the depth of Jakob's depravity. A small collection of items wrapped in oiled cloth, a handful of letters, some coins, and a photograph of Mara taken years earlier. She looked younger in the picture, softer somehow, with hope in her eyes that the present Mara had learned to hide. The letters were what made Bo's hands shake with suppressed violence. Written in a careful feminine script, they told the story of a woman writing to her sister in Denver, begging for help, describing escalating abuse, and finally, in the most recent letter, revealing that she was pregnant and terrified. He said, "If I ever tried to leave, he'd find me and kill anyone who helped me." Mara's voice came from behind him. She'd moved as quietly as snow, holding hope against her shoulder. Said he had friends who owed him favors, men who wouldn't think twice about putting a bullet in a woman or a child. Bo turned to face her, the letters still in his hand. "You wrote these?" "I never sent them," she said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "Sarah, my sister, she thinks I'm happy here, thinks I found a good man and a good life. I couldn't bear to tell her the truth, couldn't bear to put her in danger." "How long?" The question came out rougher than Bo intended. 3 years married?" Mara said. 2 years of hell." She moved to the window, looking out at the pristine snow that covered the ugliness of the world beneath. It started small the way these things do. A hard word here, a shove there. By the time I understood what he really was, I was already trapped. No family close by, no friends, no money of my own. And then she touched her belly where hope had been growing. Then I was carrying his child, and he made it clear what would happen if I tried to run. Bo had known men like Jacob Hartwell, had ridden with some of them in his darker days. Men who saw women and children as property to be used and discarded, who found their pleasure in causing pain to those weaker than themselves. The kind of men who made decent people lock their doors at night and taught children to be afraid of shadows. "Where is he now?" Bo asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Mara was quiet for a long moment, rocking Hope gently as she stared out at the endless white landscape. "He's not coming back," she said finally. "Not yet anyway. This was his way of finishing things, leaving me tied up to die in childbirth, making it look like an accident. The grieving widower left alone to raise his child, except there wouldn't be a child to raise." The coldness in her voice when she said it made Bo realize that Mara Lynn Hartwell was stronger than her circumstances might suggest. She'd had time to think about her situation, to understand exactly what had been done to her and why. That kind of clear-eyed assessment of evil took a special kind of courage. "But you're not dead," Bo pointed out, "and neither is Hope. That's got to complicate his plans some." Mara turned from the window, and for the first time since he'd found her, Bo saw something harder than fear in her eyes. Something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Yes," she said simply, "it does." The way she said it made Bo study her more carefully. There was something she wasn't telling him, something that lurked beneath her surface, calm like ice beneath snow. But before he could pursue it further, the sound of horses approaching made them both freeze. Bo moved to the window, careful to stay out of sight. 2 riders were approaching through the snow, moving slowly but steadily toward the cabin. They weren't riding like men caught in a storm seeking shelter. They were riding like men with purpose, men who knew exactly where they were going. "Friends of yours?" Bo asked, though the tension in Mara's body already gave him the answer. "Jacob's friends," she confirmed, her voice tight with fear. "Bill Morrison and his son Tommy. They help Jacob with his business ventures." Bo didn't need to ask what kind of business ventures required the sort of men who would ride through. A blizzard to visit an isolated homestead. His hand found the grip of his Colt, the familiar weight both comforting and troubling. He'd hoped those days were behind him, but the past had a way of catching up to a man, especially when that man was trying to do right. "They can't know I'm here," Mara said urgently. "If they see you, if they think Jacob might have told you anything about their operations." "What operations?" Bo asked, though he was already moving, gathering his gear and checking his weapons. "Cattle. Rustling mostly, some robbery. Jacob always said it was small-time work, but lately—" She shifted Hope to one arm and moved to a loose stone in the fireplace, pulling out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Lately, he'd been talking about bigger jobs. Said he and the boys were going to make enough money to disappear, start fresh, somewhere else." The bundle contained more letters, but these were different, written in a rough, masculine hand and bearing recent dates. As Bo scanned them quickly, a picture emerged of a gang planning something ambitious. References to the Denver job, mentions of enough gold to set us all up for life, and most troubling of all, a timetable that put the robbery just weeks away. "Jesus," Bo breathed. "They're planning to hit the Cattlemen's Bank in Denver. That's not small time. That's the kind of job that brings federal marshals down on everyone within 100 miles. The riders were closer now, close enough that Bo could make out details. The older man was thick-set and bearded, sitting his horse like someone comfortable with violence. The younger one was lean and nervous, constantly looking around as if expecting trouble. Both carried rifles across their saddles and wore the kind of clothes that suggested they spent more time outdoors than in town. "There's a root cellar," Mara said quickly, "behind the cabin, covered by an old piece of canvas. If you can get there without them seeing—" But Bo was already shaking his head. "I'm not leaving you alone with them. Not after what I've seen. In this cabin." "You don't understand," Mara insisted. "They think I'm dead. If they find me alive, if they think there's any chance I might have survived to tell what I know—" She didn't need to finish. Men planning a job like the Denver robbery wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who might pose a threat to their plans. A woman who knew too much was a loose end that needed tying off. But Bo had made his choice the moment he'd cut the ropes from her wrists. "I'm not running," he said firmly, "and I'm not letting them hurt you or Hope." The sound of boots on the cabin's wooden steps ended their conversation. Bo moved quickly, positioning himself beside the door where he'd be hidden when it opened. Mara sat in the chair near the stove, arranging her skirts to hide the blood-stained rope and trying to look like a woman recovering from a difficult birth rather than someone who'd barely escaped death. The knock, when it came, was perfunctory. The kind of knock men make when they don't really expect an answer. "Mara, you in there?" The voice was gravelly, tinged with the kind of casual cruelty that made honest people cross the street. "Jakob sent us to check on you." Mara met Bo's eyes for a moment, and he saw her make her own choice. When she spoke, her voice was weak, tired but not surprised. "Bill, is that you? Come in, the door's not locked." The door swung open, letting in a gust of cold air and two men who brought the smell of horses' whiskey and violence with them. Bill Morrison was even uglier up close, with small, mean eyes and the kind of smile that never reached beyond his mouth. His son Tommy hung back near the door, nervous and jumpy, his hand never far from his gun. "Well, I'll be damned," Bill said, taking in the scene with apparent satisfaction. "Jacob said you might not make it through the birthing, but here you are fit as a fiddle." "Barely," Mara said, cradling Hope closer. "It was difficult. Is Jacob with you?" Bill's smile widened, showing teeth yellowed by tobacco and neglect. "Jacob's taking care of some business in town. Asked us to ride out and make sure you and the baby were doing all right." His eyes moved around the cabin, noting details with the practiced gaze of a man who'd searched many rooms for many reasons. "Looks like you managed just fine on your own." "The midwife came," Mara lied smoothly. "Mrs. Patterson, from the next valley over. She left this morning when the storm cleared." It was a good lie, the kind that might explain away any evidence of help without raising too many questions. But Bo could see that Bill wasn't entirely convinced. The man's eyes kept moving, searching for something that didn't fit the story they'd been told. "That's funny," Bill said conversationally. "We didn't see any tracks leaving this place. Fresh. Snow would have covered them, I suppose, but still." He moved closer to Mara, and Bo tensed, ready to move. "Jakob was real specific about what we might find here. Real specific." The threat in his voice was unmistakable now, and Mara's face went pale. Hope began to fuss, sensing her mother's tension, and the baby's cries filled the cabin with an innocence that made the men's presence seem even more obscene. "I don't know what you mean," Mara said, but her voice shook slightly. Bill reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of rope, the same braided leather that had bound Mara to the stove. "Jakob said we might find this laying around. Said if we did, we'd know things hadn't gone according to plan." His smile turned predatory. "Looks like they didn't." That was when Bo stepped out from behind the door, his Colt already in his hand and trained on Bill Morrison's chest. "I'd say they went exactly according to plan," Bo said quietly. "Just not Jacob's plan." The silence that followed Bo's words stretched tight as a hangman's rope, Bill Morrison's hand froze halfway to his gun, his eyes calculating the distance between himself and the stranger who'd appeared from nowhere. Tommy Morrison pressed, himself against the door frame, his face gone white with the sudden realization that what should have been a simple clean-up job had just turned deadly complicated. "Well now," Bill said slowly, his voice carefully neutral, "seems like we got ourselves a situation here." Bo kept his Colt steady, aimed center mass at the older man's chest. At this distance, he wouldn't miss, and they all knew it. "Only situation we got is you boys turning around and riding out of here. Right now." "Can't do that, friend," Bill replied, his tone almost conversational. "See, we got orders." Jakob was real clear about what needed doing if things didn't go the way he planned. "Jakob's orders don't mean much to me," Bo said. "But I'll tell you what does mean something. That woman and her baby, and anybody who means them harm, is going to have to go through me first." Tommy Morrison's voice cracked when he spoke. "Pa, maybe we should just—" "Shut up, boy," Bill snapped, never taking his eyes off Bo. "This here's a complication, but it ain't insurmountable." He studied Bo's face, noting the steady hands, the calm eyes, the way he held the gun like he'd been born with it. "You got the look of a man who's been on the wrong side of the law. What's your name, stranger?" Bo hesitated for just a moment. Once he spoke his name, there'd be no taking it back. Bill Morrison looked like the type who'd remember faces and names, who'd have connections throughout the territory. But Mara and Hope needed protection, and sometimes protection came at a price. "Bo Callahan," he said finally. Bill's eyes widened slightly. "Black Bo Callahan? Well, I'll be damned. Heard you were dead." "Heard wrong," Bo replied tersely. "Pa," Tommy whispered urgently, "that's the man who robbed the Colorado Central. Killed them bank guards in Denver 3 years back." The weight of his reputation settled over the cabin like smoke. Bo saw Mara's eyes widen, saw her unconsciously pull Hope closer to her chest. He'd known this moment would come eventually, the moment when his past would catch up to his present. He just hadn't expected it to happen while he was trying to save someone instead of destroy them. "That was a different time," Bo said quietly. "Different man." Bill Morrison laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin cup. "A man don't change his nature, Callahan. Once a killer, always a killer. Hell, maybe this works out better than we thought. You kill the woman and the baby, we split Jacob's share of the Denver job 3 ways instead of 4. The casual way. He talked about murder, made Bo's finger tighten on the trigger. "I told you, I'm not the same man I was." "Prove it," Bill said with a cold smile. "Put that gun down and walk away. Let us finish what Jacob started." "Can't do that." "Then I guess we got ourselves a problem." Bill's hand moved toward his gun, with practiced speed, but Bo was faster. The gunshot echoed through the cabin like thunder, and Bill Morrison staggered backward, clutching his shoulder. His gun fell to the floor with a clatter that seemed unnaturally loud in the aftermath of violence. Tommy Morrison yelped and scrambled for his own weapon, but found himself looking down the barrel of Bo's Colt before he could clear leather. "Don't," Bo said simply. "Your pa's still breathing, but that can change real quick if you do something stupid." The young man's hands shook as he slowly raised them. "Please, mister, I don't want no trouble." "Then you shouldn't have come here." "Looking for it," Bo replied, but his voice was gentler when he addressed the boy. Tommy couldn't be more than 17, with the soft face of someone who'd been following his father's lead without thinking too hard about where it might take him. Bill Morrison was cursing steadily, a string of profanity that would have made a mule skinner blush. Blood seeped through his fingers where he pressed them against his wounded shoulder, but Bo could see it wasn't fatal. He'd aimed to disable, not to kill. Another sign that maybe he really had changed. "You shot me, you son of a—" "I could have killed you," Bo interrupted. "Next time, I might not be so merciful. Mara, you got anything we can use for bandages?" She nodded mutely, still staring at him with a mixture of fear and something else he couldn't quite identify. Moving carefully, she handed Hope to Bo and went to fetch clean cloth from the trunk by the bed. Holding the baby felt strange and wonderful at the same time. Hope was so small, so fragile, yet she'd already survived more in her few hours of life than many people faced in years. She looked up at him with unfocused eyes, and Bo felt something shift in his chest, a protective instinct that was fiercer and cleaner than any emotion he'd felt in a long time. "Why?" Mara asked quietly, as she bound Bill's shoulder with efficient, impersonal care. "Why didn't you kill him?" It was a fair question. The old Bo Callahan would have put bullets in both men without hesitation. Hell, the old Bo probably would have been working with them rather than against them. "Because killing's easy," he said finally. "It's staying human that's hard." Bill Morrison glared at him through pain-narrowed eyes. "You think this is over, Callahan? You think Jacob's going to let this slide? He'll come for you, and when he does, he won't come alone." "Let him come," Bo said. "But he better understand that things have changed around here." "What things?" Tommy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Bo looked at Mara, saw the way. She held herself, straight and strong despite everything she'd been through. Saw the determination in her eyes, the fierce love she felt for her daughter. This wasn't just about protecting them anymore. This was about something bigger, something that might actually be worth fighting for. "This is my family now," he said simply, "and I protect what's mine." The words surprised him, as much as they did everyone else in the room. He'd never had a family, never really wanted one. Families meant responsibility, commitment, the kind of ties that could drag a man down or get him killed. But looking at Mara and Hope, he realized that some ties were worth the risk. After they'd patched up Bill and sent the Morrisons on their way with a clear warning about what would happen if they returned, Bo and Mara found themselves alone again. The cabin felt different now, smaller somehow, as if the violence had changed the very air inside it. "Is it true?" Mara asked as she fed Hope. "What they said about you?" Bo was cleaning his gun, a ritual that had become as automatic as breathing. "Over the years, most of it," he admitted. "I rode with the Dalton gang for 2 years, robbed banks, trains, whatever looked profitable. The Denver job, that went bad, real bad. 2 guards died, and a customer got caught in the crossfire. An old man who was just trying to make a deposit." His hands stilled on the gun's cylinder. "That's when I knew I had to get out, when I saw what I'd become, what I was capable of. So I took my share of the money and disappeared. Been running ever since." "But you saved us," Mara said softly. "You could have ridden on, left us to face whatever was coming alone. Why didn't you?" It was the same question she'd asked the night before, and Bo still wasn't sure he had a good answer. "Maybe because I needed saving too," he said finally. "Maybe because a man gets tired of being the villain in every story." Over the following days, as the snow melted and the world began to show signs of early spring, they developed routines that felt surprisingly natural. Bo repaired what he could around the homestead, fixing loose boards, patching the roof, reinforcing the door. Mara cooked simple meals from their meager supplies and cared for Hope with the fierce devotion of a mother who'd almost lost everything. But beneath the domestic calm, tension simmered like water about to boil. They both knew that Bill Morrison's visit was just the beginning. Jacob would return eventually, and when he did, he'd bring more men and more guns than Bo could handle alone. "We should leave," Mara said one evening, as they sat by the fire. Hope slept peacefully in her arms, tiny fists curled against her chest. "Pack up what we can carry and head for Denver. I have a sister there who might help us." Bo had been thinking the same thing, but something in him rebelled against the idea of running. He'd spent 5 years looking over his shoulder, never staying in one place long enough to call it home. The thought of starting that life again, especially with a woman and child in tow, made his chest tight with familiar anxiety. "Running's dangerous too," he said. "Jacob knows this territory better than we do. He'd track us down before we made it 50 miles. Then what do you suggest?" Bo stared into the fire, watching the flames dance over the split wood. "We make our stand here. This is your home, Mara, your land. Maybe it's time someone stood up to Jacob Hartwell and his friends." "You're talking about a war," she said quietly. "I'm talking about justice." He looked at her then, seeing the doubt and fear in her eyes. "I know what I am, Mara. I know what I've done. But I also know that some things are worth fighting for, even if the fight costs you everything." She was quiet for a long time, studying his face in the firelight. "You really mean it, don't you? You'd risk your life for us." "Already am," he pointed out. "The moment I cut those ropes, I picked a side, might as well see it through." That night, as Mara slept with Hope curled beside her, Bo sat by the window and watched the darkness. Somewhere out there, Jacob Hartwell was planning his next move. Somewhere out there, men with guns and cruel intentions were deciding how to deal with the complications that had arisen in their simple plan. But for the first time in years, Bo wasn't running from a fight. He was preparing for one. And that, he realized, made all the difference in the world. The third week after Hope's birth brought warmer weather and the kind of spring sunlight that made the Wyoming territory look almost gentle. But it also brought discoveries that changed everything Bo thought he knew about Mara Lynn Hartwell. It started with the books. Bo had been reinforcing the cabin's shutters when he noticed a loose board behind the bed. What he found hidden in the wall cavity made him stop and stare. A collection of volumes that belonged in a library, not a frontier homestead. Shakespeare's complete works, bound in leather that had seen careful handling. A medical text on anatomy and childbirth. Books on law, philosophy, even a treatise on women's rights that had been published just 2 years earlier. "Find something interesting?" Mara's voice came from behind him, tinged with amusement and something else. A wariness. That suggested she'd been waiting for this moment. Bo turned, holding a slim volume of poetry. "These are yours?" "They were my father's," she said, settling Hope in her makeshift cradle. "He was a lawyer in St. Louis before the war. Believed education was the only thing that couldn't be taken away from you, no matter how poor you became, or how far you fell. And he taught you to read all this?" Mara's smile was complex, layered with pride and sadness. "He taught me to read Latin and Greek too. Said a mind was like a garden. Tend it properly, and it would feed you for life. Neglect it, and it would grow nothing but weeds." Bo had been around educated people before, usually as someone trying to rob them, and he recognized the quality of thought behind Mara's simple words. This wasn't a frontier wife who'd learned her letters at a church school. This was a woman who could discuss philosophy and law, who could quote Shakespeare from memory. "Jacob know about this?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Jacob thinks reading anything besides the Bible is a waste of time for a woman," Mara said, her voice hardening. "He burned some of my books the first year we were married, said they gave me ideas above my station." The casual cruelty of it made Bo's jaw clench. Burning books was like burning part of someone's soul, especially for someone who'd clearly found refuge in learning. "But you saved these." "I hid them before he could find them, along with some other things he wouldn't have approved of." She moved to the fireplace and removed another loose stone, this one revealing a small tin box. Inside, Bo glimpsed papers, covered with careful handwriting, what looked like legal documents, and something that made his blood run cold. A small Derringer pistol, no bigger than a woman's hand, but deadly at close range. "Mara, I'm not the helpless victim you found tied to that stove," she said quietly, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that was both reassuring and unsettling. "I mean, I was helpless in that moment. Jacob made sure of that, but I've been preparing for this day for longer than you might think." She pulled out a leather journal, its pages filled with careful notations in her precise handwriting. As Bo scanned the entries, a picture emerged that was far more complex than the simple story of an abused wife. Mara had been documenting Jacob's activities for months. Names, dates, locations, details about the cattle rustling operation, including which ranches were being targeted and where the stolen livestock was being sold. Information about the men Jacob worked with, their habits, their weaknesses. Most importantly, she'd been tracking the planning for the Denver bank robbery with the thoroughness of a detective building a case. "You've been spying on him," Bo said, impressed despite himself. "I've been surviving," Mara corrected. "Information is power, and I needed every advantage I could get if I was going to escape with my life and my child's." One entry in particular caught Beau's attention. Written just 2 weeks before Hope's birth, it detailed a conversation Mara had overheard between Jacob and Bill Morrison about cleaning up loose ends before the Denver job. Her name was specifically mentioned, along with suggestions about making her death look accidental. "You knew," Beau said, looking up from the journal. "You knew he was planning to kill you." "I suspected," she admitted. Jacob had been getting more violent, more unpredictable, and he'd been asking strange questions about my family, whether anyone would come looking for me if something happened. When he tied me to that stove, I knew my suspicions were right. The implications hit Beau like a physical blow. "That means you expected someone to come. You were waiting for rescue." Mara's smile was sad but determined. "I was waiting for a chance. You gave me that chance." Over the following days, as they continued to prepare for whatever Jacob might throw at them, Beau began to see the full depth of Mara's intelligence and strength. She wasn't just educated, she was strategic, thinking several moves ahead like a chess player planning an endgame. When Beau suggested they should scout the approaches to the homestead, Mara produced hand-drawn maps showing every trail, every hiding spot, every natural defensive position within 5 miles. When he worried about their ammunition supply, she revealed a cache of bullets and powder hidden in the barn, stolen bit by bit from Jacob's own stores. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked one evening as they cleaned weapons together. "Since the first time he hit me," she said matter-of-factly. "It was 3 months after we married. He came home drunk and angry about a poker game gone wrong. When I tried to comfort him, he backhanded me so hard I saw stars." She checked the action. On the Derringer with practiced ease. "That's when I realized the man I'd married was very different from the man who'd courted me. Why didn't you leave then? Where would I go? I had no money, no family within 1,000 miles, no way to support myself." She looked down at Hope, sleeping peacefully despite the conversation about violence happening around her. "And by then, I was already carrying his child. A pregnant woman alone on the frontier doesn't have many options. So you stayed and planned." "I stayed and learned about his business, his friends, his weaknesses. I figured that when the time came, knowledge would serve me better than desperation." The more Beau learned about Mara's preparations, the more he realized that his arrival at the cabin hadn't been as random as he'd thought. She'd been setting the stage for Jacob's downfall long before the storm brought Beau to her door. "The rope," he said suddenly, understanding flooding through him. "You could have cut yourself free at any time. You had knives hidden, weapons, tools, but you stayed tied up." Mara nodded slowly. "Jacob needed to believe I was helpless. If he suspected I was planning something, he would have killed me outright instead of trying to make it look accidental. So I played the part of the terrified victim until someone came along who could be your weapon instead of his. I didn't know it would be you specifically," she admitted, "but I knew someone would come eventually. The storm was too severe for any traveler to ignore a homestead, even one that seemed abandoned. I was counting on basic human decency to bring someone to investigate. It was a brilliant plan, if desperate. She'd used Jacob's own cruelty against him, turning her apparent helplessness into a trap. But it was also incredibly dangerous. If the wrong person had found her, or if no one had come at all, she and Hope would have died. You risked everything on the hope that a stranger would help you. I risked everything on the belief that most people are fundamentally good," she corrected. "That when faced with genuine suffering, decent human beings will try to help, even if it costs them something." Beau thought about that as he watched her nurse Hope by the firelight. She'd gambled her life and her daughter's life on faith in human nature. In his experience, that was usually a losing bet. But in this case, her faith had been rewarded. "What's the next part of your plan?" he asked. Mara was quiet for a long moment, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Originally, I thought if I survived and someone helped me, we'd take Hope and run. get as far from Jacob as possible, and start over somewhere he'd never find us. But that was before I understood what kind of man had come to help me. She looked at him directly, her gaze steady and knowing. "You're not the kind to run from a fight, are you, Bo Callahan?" He wasn't, and they both knew it. The old Bo might have taken the money and disappeared, but that man had died somewhere. In the years of running and hiding, the man sitting in this cabin, watching over a woman and child who'd become more important to him than his own safety, was someone different. Someone who'd finally found something worth standing for. "Jakob's going to come," Bo said. "Probably. With more men than we can handle." "I know. We might not survive it. I know that too." She adjusted Hope's position and continued nursing. The picture of maternal calm despite the conversation about their potential deaths. "But I'd rather die fighting than live in fear, and I'd rather Hope grow up knowing her mother fought for her freedom than wondering why I chose slavery instead." That night, as they planned their defenses and discussed strategy, Bo realized that what he'd initially seen as a rescue mission had become something else entirely. Mara hadn't needed saving. She'd needed a partner, someone with the skills and willingness to help her finish what she'd started. Looking at her across the table, her hair catching the lamplight as she sketched defensive positions with military precision, Bo felt something he hadn't experienced in years, respect that was touched with the beginning of something deeper. Mara Lynn Hartwell was nobody's victim. She was a strategist, a survivor, and quite possibly the most dangerous woman he'd ever met. The fact that she was also beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely devoted to her daughter only made her more formidable. Jacob Hartwell had made a crucial mistake when he'd underestimated his wife, and when he returned to finish what he'd started, he was going to discover just how costly that mistake had been. Spring came to Wyoming territory like a cautious woman testing the temperature of bathwater, slowly, carefully, with the constant threat of winter's return. But by the first week of April, the snow had mostly melted, revealing a landscape that was both beautiful and treacherous. Green grass pushed through the brown earth, wildflowers dotted the hillsides, and the streams ran full with snowmelt. It was the kind of weather that made a man think about planting crops and building a future. It was also the kind of weather that made travel easy for men with violent intentions. Bo was reinforcing the cabin's defenses when he saw the rider. Approaching from the east, a single man on a good horse, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged in the territory. Bo's hand moved instinctively to his gun, but something about the rider's posture suggested he wasn't an immediate threat. "Mara," he called quietly. "Someone's coming." She appeared in the doorway, Hope cradled in her arms, and watched as the rider drew closer. When she saw his face, her expression shifted from wariness to something more complex. Recognition tinged with old friendship and current caution. "It's Samuel Garrett," she said. "He owns the Double G Ranch about 15 miles south of here. He was a friend of my father's before I married Jacob." Samuel Garrett was a man in his late 50s, with the weathered face and steady hands, of someone who'd spent decades working cattle under the Wyoming sun. His clothes were well made, but practical, and he rode his horse with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. When he dismounted near the cabin, his movements were careful and deliberate, the movements of a man who understood that unexpected visitors might not always be welcome. "Mara Lynn," he said, removing his hat and running a hand through graying hair. "Heard tell you had your baby. Wanted to come by and see how you were faring." There was something in his tone that suggested he'd heard more than just news about the birth. His eyes moved from Mara to Bo, taking in the stranger's presence with the practiced assessment of someone who'd survived on the frontier by reading people quickly and accurately. "Samuel," Mara said warmly, but Bo could hear the underlying tension in her voice. "It's good to see you. This is Bo Callahan. He's been helping me since Hope was born." Garrett's eyes sharpened at the name, and Bo knew his reputation had preceded him once again. But instead of reaching for a weapon or backing away, the older man simply nodded. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "I've heard stories about you. Some of them probably even true. Most of them, Bo replied honestly, though I'm hoping to write some new ones. Something in Bo's tone must have convinced Garrett that he wasn't dealing with the same man who'd terrorized banks across 3 territories. The rancher's posture relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained alert. Mind if I step down and visit a spell? Garrett asked. Been a long ride, and I've got some things that need discussing. Over coffee that was stronger than leather and nearly as bitter, Samuel Garrett revealed why he'd really come calling. The news he brought was troubling, painting a picture of a community on edge and men preparing for violence. Jacob's been in town, Garrett said, accepting a cup from Mara with a nod of thanks. Been there near a week now, drinking hard and talking loud about his business ventures. Most folks are giving him wide berth, but he's been gathering men. Unsavory types, mostly. The kind who hire out their guns to whoever's paying. Bo and Mara exchanged glances. They'd expected Jacob to return, but the news that he was actively recruiting help was more troubling than either had anticipated. How? Many men? Bo asked. Hard to say for certain, Garrett replied. I counted at least 6 when I was in town yesterday, and there might be more. All of them armed, all of them looking like they're planning something bigger than cattle rustling. Mara shifted hope to her other arm, her face thoughtful. The Denver job, she said quietly. He's putting together his crew for the bank robbery. Garrett's eyebrows rose. Bank robbery, you know about that? I know about a lot of things Jacob doesn't think I know, Mara said with grim satisfaction, including the fact that he's planning to hit the Cattleman's Bank in Denver next month. The older man whistled low. That's federal business, Mara Lynn. The kind of job that brings marshals and Pinkertons down on everyone within 100 miles. I know, she said simply, which is why we can't let it happen. Garrett looked between them, his expression troubled. We? Mara Lynn, I understand you. Got grievances against Jacob, but this is dangerous territory you're talking about entering. I'm already in dangerous territory, she replied. Jacob tried to kill me, Samuel, tied me to that stove, and left me to die in childbirth. If Bo hadn't come along when he did, Hope and I would both be dead right now. The rancher's face darkened, with anger. He did what? Bo filled in the details, watching Garrett's expression grow more grim with each revelation. By the time he finished describing what they'd found in the cabin, the evidence of systematic abuse, the plans for the bank, robbery, the casual way Jacob had discussed murder, Samuel Garrett looked like a man ready for war. I knew Jacob Hartwell was no good, Garrett said finally. Suspected he was involved in some of the cattle that's gone missing over the years. But this, he shook his head, this is beyond the pale, even for a man like him. The question is, what do we do about it? Bo said. Garrett was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if the answers might be written in the dark liquid. When he looked up, his expression was resolute. The way I see it, we got 2 choices, he said. We can notify the territorial marshal and let the law handle it, or we can handle it ourselves. What's wrong with letting the law handle it? Mara asked. Timing, Garrett replied. The nearest marshal is 3 days' ride from here, assuming we can find him. By the time he gets organized and rides back with a posse, Jacob could be long gone. And that's assuming he believes our story about the bank robbery. Without proof. We have proof, Mara said, rising to fetch her hidden journal. Names, dates, details about their plans, everything Jacob thought I was too stupid to understand. Garrett examined the journal with growing amazement. This is thorough. Mara Lynn, you could have been a detective. I was fighting for my life, she said. Simply, you learn to pay attention to details when your survival depends on it. But even as they discussed their options, Bo could see the fundamental problem they faced. Jacob wasn't just planning a bank robbery. He was planning to eliminate anyone who could testify against him. That meant Mara was still in mortal danger, and now that Bo had involved himself, he was a target too. There's something else, Garrett said reluctantly, something I heard in town that you need to know about. He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a wanted poster bearing Beau's likeness and offering a substantial reward for his capture. But this wasn't one of the old posters from his outlaw days. This one was fresh, recently printed, and it bore an additional notation that made Beau's blood run cold. Wanted in connection with the murder of Bill Morrison. Beau read aloud, armed and extremely dangerous. Last seen in the company of Mara Lynn Hartwell. Bill Morrison's dead, Mara asked, her face pale. Found shot to death outside of town 2 days ago, Garrett confirmed. Someone put 3 bullets in his chest at close range. Professional work, by all accounts. Beau stared at the poster, his mind racing. He'd wounded Bill Morrison, not killed him. Had only shot him in the shoulder as a warning, but someone had finished the job, and they'd made sure Beau would be blamed for it. Jacob, Mara said, reaching the same conclusion. Bill must have told him about the encounter here at the cabin. Jacob couldn't risk Bill talking to the law, so he killed him and made it look like your work. It was brilliant in its simplicity. Jacob had eliminated a potential witness and framed Beau for murder at the same time. Now Beau couldn't go to the authorities without risking arrest, and Jacob had a legitimate reason to hunt him down. This changes things, Garrett said quietly. With a murder warrant out on you, Mr. Callahan, you can't exactly walk into the marshal's office and report a planned bank robbery, which means we handle this ourselves, Beau said grimly. Beau, Mara said, her voice concerned, maybe you should leave. Take one of Samuel's horses and head for Colorado or Utah. Get as far away from here as possible. The suggestion hit him like a physical blow. For a moment he was tempted. It would be easier to run, to disappear into the wilderness and start over somewhere else. He'd done it before, could do it again, but the thought of leaving Mara and Hope to face Jacob alone made his chest tight with something that felt like panic. I'm not running, he said firmly. Not from Jacob, not from the law, not from anything. I made a promise to protect you and Hope, and I mean to keep it, even if it gets you killed, especially if it gets me killed. He looked at her directly, willing her to understand. I've spent 5 years running from who I was, trying to outrace my past, but I can't outrun it, Mara. It's part of me, and it always will be. The only thing I can do is choose what I do with it. Samuel Garrett watched this exchange with the interest of a man who'd lived long enough to recognize significant moments when he saw them. Sounds like you folks have made your decision, he said finally. The question is, what kind of help do you need? Beau looked at the older man with surprise. You're offering to help. Jacob Hartwell tried to murder a woman and her newborn child, Garrett said simply. Far as I'm concerned, that makes him an enemy of every decent person in this territory. And besides, he added with a slight smile, I've been looking for an excuse to clean up this valley for years. This seems like as good a reason as any. As the afternoon wore on, they planned their strategy with the thoroughness of generals preparing for war. Garrett knew the territory and the people, could provide intelligence about Jacob's movements and potential allies. Mara had detailed knowledge of Jacob's plans and methods, information that would be crucial in anticipating his next moves, and Beau had the skills and experience necessary to turn their knowledge into effective action. But underneath the planning and preparation, Beau was acutely aware of the growing tension between himself and Mara. The way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. The way their hands brushed when they passed documents back and forth. The way the space between them seemed to crackle with unspoken possibilities. Mara, he said quietly when Garrett stepped outside to tend to his horse, I need you to know something. She looked up from Hope, who was sleeping peacefully despite the talk of violence and danger around her. I care about you, Beau continued, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. About both of you. More than I should, maybe. More than is smart for a man in my position. Her eyes softened, and for a moment the careful control she'd maintained throughout the day slipped. Beau, I know it's complicated, he said quickly. I know you're still legally married, and I know my past makes me poor material for for whatever this might become. But I needed you to know, in case things go bad when Jacob comes." Instead of answering with words, Mara set Hope gently in her cradle and moved to where Bo stood. She reached up and touched his face with fingers that were soft despite their calluses, studying his features as if memorizing them. "You're a good man, Bo Callahan," she said softly. "Whatever you were before, whatever you've done, you're a good man now. And when this is over, when Jacob is no longer a threat, we'll talk about what that means for us." The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, full of promise and possibility. It tasted like hope and felt like coming home after years of wandering in the wilderness. When they broke apart, Samuel Garrett was standing in the doorway with a knowing smile on his weathered face. "Well," he said mildly, "I can see you folks have more than one kind of future to fight for." 3 days after Samuel Garrett's visit, Mara made a decision that terrified and impressed Bo in equal measure. She announced that they were going to town. "It's too dangerous," Bo said immediately. "Jacob's there with his crew, and now I've got a murder warrant on my head. Walking into town would be like sticking our necks into a noose." Mara was carefully folding a small white christening gown she'd been working on for weeks, her stitches precise and delicate despite the rough conditions of their life. The gown was beautiful in its simplicity, white cotton, with tiny pearl buttons and delicate embroidery around the collar. It was the kind of garment that spoke of a mother's love and hope for her child's future. "That's exactly why we need to go," she said, not looking up from her work. "People need to see that I'm alive, that hope is healthy, that we're not the victims Jacob wants them to think we are. They need to see us as a family with a wanted outlaw for a father," Bo pointed out grimly. "A family with a protector who stands between them and the kind of men who would murder women and children," Mara corrected. "There's a difference, and the people in town are smart enough to see it." Bo wasn't convinced, but he understood the strategic thinking behind her decision. Public opinion mattered on the frontier, where formal law enforcement was often days or weeks away. If the community saw Mara and Hope as Jacob's victims rather than his property, it would be harder for him to justify whatever violence he was planning. "Besides," Mara added, finally looking up with a slight smile, "Hope needs to be christened. It's important to me that she be welcomed into the community properly, as a legitimate child with nothing to be ashamed of." The christening gown represented more than just a religious ceremony. It was Mara's declaration that Hope belonged in respectable society, not in the shadows where Jacob had tried to keep them. It was an act of defiance disguised as domesticity, and Bo was beginning to understand that Mara specialized in that particular kind of warfare. Samuel Garrett had volunteered to escort them, lending an air of respectability to their expedition. As one of the territory's most established ranchers, his presence would provide some protection against immediate violence, though Bo knew it wouldn't stop Jacob entirely. "You sure about this?" Garrett asked as they prepared to leave the homestead. "Once we ride into town, there's no taking it back. Jacob will know you're alive and that you've got allies." "He already knows," Mara replied, settling Hope into a sling that would keep the baby close to her chest during the ride. "Bill Morrison told him about Bo before Jacob killed him. This isn't about hiding anymore. This is about choosing the battlefield." The ride to town took most of the morning, following trails that wound through valleys, painted green with spring grass and dotted with early wildflowers. Under different circumstances, it would have been a pleasant journey. The weather was mild, the scenery was beautiful, and Hope slept peacefully against her mother's chest, lulled by the gentle motion of the horse. But Bo rode with his hand, never far from his gun, constantly scanning the horizon for threats. Every stand of trees could hide an ambush. Every rise could conceal riders with hostile intentions. The wanted poster had changed everything. He was no longer just a man trying to protect a woman and child. He was a fugitive whose very presence put them all in danger. "Relax," Garrett said, noting Bo's tension. Jacob's not stupid enough to try anything on the open trail. Too many witnesses, too many ways for it to go wrong. If he's planning something, it'll be in town where he can control the situation. The town of Cedar Falls wasn't much to look at. A collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. But it was civilization of a sort, with a general store, a saloon, a church, and about 200 people who decided this patch of Wyoming was worth calling home. News of their arrival spread quickly through the small community. People emerged from shops and houses to stare at the unlikely family riding down Main Street, the educated woman who'd married badly, the infamous outlaw who'd disappeared 3 years ago, and the baby who represented either hope or scandal, depending on who was doing the judging. "Mara Lynn!" The voice belonged to Eleanor Patterson, the banker's wife, and the closest thing Cedar Falls had to a social leader. She hurried across the street, with her skirts lifted to avoid the mud, her face a mixture of concern and curiosity. "My dear, we heard about the baby. Is it true that—" She stopped short when she got a good look at Bo, recognition dawning in her eyes. "Mrs. Patterson," Mara said calmly, "I'd like you to meet Mr. Callahan. He helped deliver hope when Jacob couldn't make it back from his business trip in time." It was smoothly done, presenting the story in a way that made Bo sound like a good Samaritan rather than a wanted criminal. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened as she looked at Hope, maternal instincts overriding her concerns about Bo's reputation. "She's beautiful," the older woman said genuinely, "and so small. You must be exhausted, my dear. The birthing process is difficult enough without doing it alone." "I wasn't alone," Mara said firmly, looking at Bo with unmistakable affection. "Mr. Callahan was very kind to stay and help." Word of their presence reached the saloon quickly, and Bo wasn't surprised when Jacob Hartwell emerged from the establishment with 3 of his men flanking him. Jacob was exactly what Bo had expected, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of good looks that had probably charmed many women before revealing the cruelty underneath. But his handsome features were marred by dissipation and anger, and his eyes held the flat, predatory stare of a man who viewed other people as objects to be used. "Well, well," Jacob said loudly enough for half the street to hear, "if it isn't my dear wife. Come to town with her, friend." The way he said friend made it clear what he was implying, and Bo felt his hand move instinctively toward his gun. But Mara's touch on his arm stopped him. "Jacob," she said evenly, "I was wondering when you'd come home to meet your daughter. It was brilliantly played." By referring to Hope as your daughter in front of witnesses, Mara was establishing Jacob's paternal responsibility while simultaneously making it clear that he'd abandoned them during the birth. The townspeople watching the confrontation would draw their own conclusions about what kind of man did such a thing. Jacob's face darkened with anger, but he was too clever to lose his temper completely in public. "Had business to attend to," he said through gritted teeth. "Important business that couldn't wait? More important than your wife and newborn child?" Mrs. Patterson interjected, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm afraid I don't understand how any business could be that pressing." Bo could see Jacob calculating, trying to figure out how to regain control of the narrative. His eyes moved from Mara to Hope to Bo, and the hatred in them was unmistakable. But surrounded by townspeople and faced with Mara's calm competence, he couldn't resort to his usual methods of intimidation. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," Jacob said finally, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining civility. "I think we've discussed things enough in private," Mara replied coolly. "From now on, I prefer witnesses." The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the drama unfolding on their main street. Bo could feel their attention like a weight, knew that every word spoken here would be repeated and analyzed throughout the territory within days. "Is it true?" The question came from Tom Mitchell, the local blacksmith, and a man whose opinion carried weight in the community. "What they're saying about you trying to hurt Mara Lynn?" Jacob's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the rage underneath. "I don't know what lies she's been telling, but She hasn't told me anything, Mitchell interrupted. But Doc Harvey examined her after Mr. Callahan brought her to town, saw the rope burns on her wrists, the bruises, saw enough to know what kind of man would tie up a woman in labor. The revelation hit Jacob like a physical blow. Bo could see him realizing that his carefully planned murder had left evidence, that witnesses had seen what he'd tried to hide. "You don't understand," Jacob said desperately. "She's not what she seems. She's been plotting against me, trying to ruin everything I've worked for." "What have you worked for, Jacob?" Mara asked quietly. "Cattle that don't belong to you. Money stolen from other people's hard work. A wife who was too afraid to speak against you." The crowd murmured, and Bo could feel the tide of public opinion turning. Jacob could see it too, and his face was growing redder with each passing moment. "You'll regret this," Jacob said, his voice low and dangerous. "All of you will regret taking her side against me." "Is that a threat, Mr. Hartwell?" Samuel Garrett stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Because if it is, I think these good people have a right to know exactly what kind of man you are." For a moment, the street was silent except for the sound of Hope's soft breathing and the creak of leather as several men shifted their weight, ready for violence. Jacob looked around at the faces surrounding him, townspeople who'd known him for years but were now seeing him clearly for the first time. "This isn't over," he said finally, backing toward the saloon. Not by a long shot. As Jacob and his men retreated, the crowd began to disperse, but not before several people approached Mara to offer their support. Mrs. Patterson invited her to bring Hope to the church for a proper christening. The doctor offered to examine both mother and child to ensure they were healthy. The banker mentioned that there might be work available for someone with Mara's obvious intelligence and education. "That went better than I expected," Garrett murmured to Bo as they watched the interactions. "It's not over yet," Bo replied, his eyes on the saloon where Jacob had disappeared. "This was just the opening move." But as he watched Mara accept the community's support with grace and dignity, Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms, Bo felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope, not just for their immediate survival, but for something larger, for the possibility of a real life, a real family, a real future. The christening took place that afternoon in the small church that served Cedar Falls in the surrounding territory. Hope wore her white gown with the pearl buttons, looking like the innocent angel she was, as the pastor blessed her and welcomed her into the community of faith. Bo stood beside Mara during the ceremony, acutely aware that many of the people present knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. But they also saw how he looked at Mara and Hope, saw the gentleness in his hands when he held the baby, saw the man he was trying to become rather than the man he'd been. When the pastor asked who would stand as Hope's protectors and guides, Mara answered clearly, her mother and the man who brought her safely into this world. It wasn't a wedding ceremony, but it felt like one. A public declaration of commitment, of family, of a future they were willing to fight for. As they prepared to leave town, several people approached them with warnings and offers of support. Jacob had been drinking heavily since the confrontation, and his men were asking questions about ammunition and supplies. The message was clear. Whatever was coming would happen soon. "You sure you want to go back to the homestead?" Dr. Harvey asked. "My wife and I would be happy to put you folks up for a few days." But Mara shook her head firmly. "Thank you, but no. If Jacob wants a fight, he'll have it on our terms, in our place." As they rode back toward the homestead in the fading light of evening, Hope's christening gown carefully packed away, and the memory of community support fresh in their minds, Bo realized that something fundamental had changed. They weren't running anymore, weren't hiding. They were standing their ground, and they weren't standing alone. The people of Cedar Falls had seen them as a family worth protecting, and that changed everything. The letter arrived 3 days after their return from town, delivered by a young boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. He rode up to the homestead at dawn, handed the envelope to Bo without a word, and disappeared back down The trail before anyone could ask questions. Bo recognized the handwriting immediately, the same careful script he'd seen in the documents hidden throughout the cabin. But this wasn't one of Mara's secret writings. This was something else entirely, something that made his blood run cold even before he opened it. "It's from Jacob," he told Mara, who was feeding Hope by the window where the morning light was strongest. "What does it say?" Bo unfolded the single sheet of paper, and as he read the contents, he felt the ground shift beneath his feet like a man standing on quicksand. "My dearest wife," the letter began in Jacob's precise handwriting. "I hope this finds you and our daughter in good health. I must confess that our recent encounter in town left me with much to consider, particularly regarding the nature of our relationship and the future of our family. You have proven yourself to be far more resourceful than I ever imagined, my dear. Your little performance in Cedar Falls was quite impressive. The grieving wife, the devoted mother, the victim of a cruel husband's abandonment. You played your part so convincingly that I almost believed it myself. But you see, Mara Lynn, I know you better than you think. I know about the books you've hidden, the letters you've written but never sent, the careful records you've been keeping of my business affairs. Most importantly, I know about the little game you've been playing with your rescuer. Did you really think I didn't know about Mr. Callahan's arrival? Did you believe I was foolish enough to leave you tied to that stove without ensuring that someone would find you? My dear wife, you have always underestimated me, and that has been your greatest mistake." Bo's hands shook as he continued reading, the implications of Jacob's words becoming clearer with each line. "You wanted a protector, someone with the skills and disposition to help you escape our marriage. So I provided one. Black Bo Callahan, the notorious outlaw with a guilty conscience, and a need for redemption. Perfect for your purposes, wouldn't you say? The storm that brought him to your door was real enough, but his presence there was no accident. I've been watching him for months, learning his patterns, understanding his weaknesses. A man with his past was always going to stop and help a woman in distress. It's the one decent instinct he has left. Bo," Mara's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What does it say?" He couldn't answer immediately. The words on the page were reshaping everything he thought he understood about the past weeks, turning his rescue of Mara and Hope into something else entirely, a manipulation so subtle and complete that he'd never suspected it. "I must admit, your romance with Mr. Callahan has developed more quickly than I anticipated. The way you look at him, the way he protects you and our daughter, it's quite touching, really. Almost enough to make a man believe in love at first sight. But here's the beauty of the situation, my dear. It doesn't matter whether your feelings are genuine or calculated. It doesn't matter whether Mr. Callahan truly loves you or is simply responding to his own desperate need for redemption. What matters is that you've both played your parts exactly as I hoped you would. You see, I needed Mr. Callahan to feel invested in your survival. I needed him to care enough about you and Hope to risk his life protecting you. Because when the time comes, and it's coming very soon, I need him to fight with everything he has." Bo sank into a chair, the letter still clutched in his trembling hands. Mara rose and moved to his side, Hope still cradled against her chest. "Tell me," she said quietly. He handed her the letter and watched her face change as she read. The color drained from her cheeks, her eyes widened with something that looked like horror, and when she finished, she sank into the chair beside him. "This isn't possible," she whispered. "He couldn't have planned all this. The storm, your arrival, the timing. It's too complicated, too many variables." But even as she said it, Bo could see the doubt in her eyes. Jacob's letter continued, and the details it contained were too specific, too accurate to be fabricated. "The Denver bank job is real, of course. My associates and I have been planning it for months, and the payoff will be substantial enough to set us all up for life. But that was never the primary objective, my dear wife. The primary objective was you. You know too much about my business. operations to be allowed to live, but simply killing you would have raised too many questions. A grieving widower with a newborn child draws sympathy. A man who murders his wife draws investigation. I needed a different solution. Enter Mr. Callahan, with his violent past and his current status as a wanted fugitive. When the authorities find your bodies at the homestead, yours, his, and unfortunately our daughter's, the story will write itself. A desperate outlaw, cornered by the law, takes a woman and child hostage before being killed in the ensuing gunfight. Tragic, but oddly surprising. Of course, there won't be any authorities involved in the actual killing. That honor will belong to me and my associates. But when the smoke clears and the bodies are found, everyone will assume that justice was served. The notorious Black Bow Callahan, finally brought down while threatening innocent lives. Mara looked up from the letter, her face pale but her eyes burning with anger. He's been playing us from the beginning. Every choice we made, every decision we thought was ours. He anticipated all of it. The rope burns on your wrists, Bo said slowly. Pieces of the puzzle falling into place. You said they were fresh when I found you, but they weren't, were they? You'd been tied up before, probably multiple times. He was conditioning you to accept it, making sure you'd react the right way when your rescuer arrived. And my hidden weapons, my preparations, Mara continued, her voice hollow with realization. He knew about all of it. Probably helped create the opportunities for me to steal ammunition and supplies. He wanted me to feel like I was being clever, like I was taking control of my own fate. The letter's final paragraphs confirmed their worst fears. By now, you're probably wondering if anything between you was real. Was your attraction to Mr. Callahan genuine, or simply a response to the situation I created? Was his protection motivated by love, or by the need to play the hero I knew he would become? The answer, my dear, is that it doesn't matter. Real or manufactured, your feelings have served their purpose. Mr. Callahan will fight to protect you, because he believes you're worth saving. You'll fight beside him, because you believe he's your salvation. And in the end, you'll both die believing that your love was something pure and meaningful. I will arrive at the homestead tomorrow at sunset with enough men to ensure that the outcome is never in doubt. You are welcome to run, of course. But we both know you won't. Mr. Callahan's pride won't let him flee from a fight, and your devotion to our daughter won't let you risk her safety on the open trail. So we'll have our final confrontation, just as I planned from the beginning. The only difference is that now you understand exactly how thoroughly you've been manipulated. Give my regards to Mr. Callahan and tell him I look forward to meeting the man who's been protecting my family. Your devoted husband, Jacob. The silence that followed was broken only by Hope's soft breathing and the distant sound of wind through the pine trees. Bo felt as if the foundations of his world had crumbled, leaving him standing on nothing but empty air. How much of it do you think is true? Mara asked finally. Bo considered the question, trying to separate his emotions from his analytical mind. The manipulation. Probably most of it. Jakob's smart enough and cruel enough to have orchestrated something like this. The question is whether it changes anything. How can it not change everything? Because regardless of how we got here, we're here now, Bo said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. Maybe Jakob did manipulate the situation. Maybe he did. And count on my need for redemption and your desperation for protection. But what he couldn't manipulate was what grew between us. The feelings, the trust, the commitment. Mara looked at him with something that might have been hope. You really believe that? I believe that a man like Jacob Hartwell understands manipulation and cruelty, but he doesn't understand love. He can create situations, but he can't create emotions. What we feel for each other, what we feel for hope, that's real, Mara. That's ours. She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if looking for signs of doubt or deception. Even knowing that he planned all this, even knowing that our entire relationship might be built on a foundation of lies? Especially knowing that, Bo replied firmly. Jacob expected us to fall apart when we learned the truth. He counted on doubt and suspicion destroying what we'd built together. If we let that happen, if we let his manipulation poison what's real between us, then he wins even before the shooting starts. Mara nodded slowly, and Bo could see her making the same choice he had, to trust in what they'd experienced together, rather than Jacob's version of events. "So what do we do now?" she asked. Bo folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. "Now, we finish what he started, but we finish it on our terms, not his." As they spent the day preparing for Jacob's arrival, Bo found himself analyzing every moment of their time together, looking for signs of manipulation or artificial emotion. But the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that Jacob had made a crucial miscalculation. Yes, the situation had been engineered. Yes, their meeting had been orchestrated. But Jacob had underestimated the power of genuine human connection. He'd created the circumstances for Bo and Mara to fall in love, but he couldn't control or predict the depth and authenticity of what grew between them. "You know what the strangest part is?" Mara said as they checked their weapons and ammunition one final time. "What's that?" "I think I would have fallen in love with you anyway," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Maybe not under these exact circumstances, maybe not this quickly. But the man you are, the way you've cared for Hope and me, that's not something Jacob could have manufactured." As the sun began to set over the Wyoming territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Bo and Mara took their positions and waited for the confrontation that would determine their future. Jacob's letter had been intended to break their spirit, to fill them with doubt and despair. Instead, it had done the opposite. By revealing the extent of his manipulation, Jacob had inadvertently proven that what Bo and Mara shared was strong enough to survive even the most elaborate deception. The devil was coming home, but he would find that his angels had learned to fight back. The evening light was fading to purple when Bo made his way to the small grove of aspen trees behind the cabin, carrying a shovel and moving with the careful deliberation of a man preparing for his own possible death. He'd hidden the weapons, cached there during his first week at the homestead, burying it deep enough to keep it safe from discovery, but shallow enough to retrieve quickly when the time came. Now, as he unearthed the oiled canvas bundle, the weight of his past settled over him like an old coat, familiar, unwelcome, but necessary for what lay ahead. The cache contained more than just guns and ammunition. It held the tools of his former trade, extra revolvers, a rifle with a telescopic sight, boxes of carefully maintained cartridges, and a collection of knives that ranged from utilitarian to lethal. Most importantly, it contained dynamite, 6 sticks wrapped in waterproof cloth, along with fuses and blasting caps. He'd stolen it from a mining operation in Colorado 3 years ago, originally intending to use it for breaking into bank vaults. Instead, it had become his insurance policy, something to level the playing field when the odds were stacked against him. "Planning to blow up the whole territory?" Mara's voice came from behind him, tinged with dark humor. Bo turned to find her watching him from the edge of the grove, Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the preparations for violence happening around her. In the twilight, Mara looked like something from a painting, mother and child, serene and beautiful against the backdrop of wild country. It was hard to reconcile that image with the strategic mind he knew lay beneath her calm exterior. "Just evening the odds," he replied, carefully packing the explosives into a leather satchel. "Jacob's bringing enough men to overrun us through sheer numbers. We need every advantage we can get." "How many men do you think he'll bring?" Bo had been considering that question all afternoon. The letter mentioned enough men to ensure the outcome is never in doubt. Based on what we know about his crew and the resources he'd need for the Denver job, I'd guess 6 to 8. All of them experienced with violence, all of them loyal to Jakob because he pays well. Against the two of us. Against the three of us, Bo corrected, glancing at Hope. Don't underestimate what fighting for your child can do to a person's capabilities. They returned to the cabin as full darkness settled over the homestead. Inside, Bo spread his arsenal across the rough wooden table, checking each weapon with the methodical attention of a craftsman, examining his tools. The Colt Navy revolver that had been his constant companion for years. A Winchester rifle that could put a bullet through a man's heart at 300 yards. The Derringer that Mara had hidden in her belongings, small enough to conceal but deadly at close range. "I've been thinking about what Jacob said in his letter," Mara said, as she cleaned the Derringer with practiced efficiency. "About how he manipulated the situation, orchestrated our meeting. And I think he made a mistake. Several mistakes. Actually," she held the small gun up to the lamplight, examining the cylinder. "Jacob understands manipulation and control, but he doesn't understand people who choose to change. He planned for you to react like the old Bo Callahan, violent, unpredictable, ultimately self-destructive." Bo paused in his cleaning of the Winchester's action. "What do you mean?" The old Bo would have taken that letter as confirmation that nothing was real, that everyone was using him. He would have gotten angry, made stupid choices, probably would have run or lashed out in ways that played right into Jakob's hands. Mara set the Derringer down and looked at him directly. "But you're not that man anymore. You read the letter, understood the manipulation, and chose to trust what we've built together anyway. That's not something Jacob could have predicted or planned for." She was right, and Bo felt some of the tension in his chest ease. The old Bo Callahan had been driven by rage and pride, making decisions based on emotion rather than strategy. The man he'd become, shaped by years of running. And 5 weeks of protecting something precious, was capable of clearer thinking. "There's something else," Mara continued. "Jacob thinks he knows me, but he only knows the woman I was when I lived in fear of him. He doesn't know the woman I've become since Hope was born, since I found someone worth fighting beside." As they continued their preparations, Bo was struck by how naturally they worked together. There was no discussion of who would take which position, no argument about strategy. Mara understood firearms and tactics with an intuition that went beyond her hidden study of military texts. She could read the terrain around the homestead like a general planning a campaign, identifying choke points and lines of sight with an accuracy that impressed him. "Where did you learn to think like this?" he asked, as she sketched defensive positions on a piece of paper. "My father was a military attorney during the war," she said without looking up from her drawing. "He served under General Sherman during the march through Georgia. Used to tell me stories about strategy and tactics, said understanding warfare was just another form of understanding human nature." Smart man, he was. He always said that the key to winning any conflict was understanding what your opponent wanted and then making sure they couldn't get it. She looked up from her sketch. "Jacob wants us dead, but he also wants it to look like justice being served. That gives us an advantage." "How?" "Because if he just wanted us dead, he could burn us out or snipe us from a distance. But he needs it to look like a legitimate confrontation. The dangerous outlaw killed while threatening innocent lives. That means he has to get close, has to make it personal." As the night deepened, they moved through the cabin and surrounding area, preparing their battlefield with the thoroughness of soldiers who knew their lives depended on every detail. Bo placed charges at strategic points, the bridge across the creek that provided the main approach to the homestead, the old oak tree that commanded the eastern approach, a section of the barn that could be brought down to block retreat routes. Mara prepared fallback positions and supply caches, hiding water, ammunition and medical supplies in locations they could reach if the main cabin became untenable. She also prepared a final contingency, a hidden cave in the rocks above the homestead where Hope could be kept safe if everything else failed. "Promise me something," she said as they made their final preparations. "If it goes bad, if there's no way for all of us to survive, you take hope and run. Don't try to make a last stand for honor or pride." Bo started to object, but she cut him off. "I'm not asking you to abandon me," she continued. "I'm asking you to save our daughter, because that's what she is now. Ours, not Jacob's, not legally. Mine alone, but ours. And if one of us has to die to ensure she lives, I want it to be me, Mara. Promise me, Bo. Promise me that Hope's life comes first, above everything else." The words stuck in his throat like broken glass, but he managed to speak them. "I promise." As midnight approached, they took up their positions and settled in. To wait. Bo was stationed near the main window with the Winchester, commanding a view of the primary approaches. Mara had positioned herself in the loft, with a clear line of sight to the secondary routes, the derringer in her hand and additional weapons within easy reach. Hope slept in her cradle between them, blissfully unaware of the violence being prepared. "In her name, Bo!" Mara's voice drifted down from the loft, soft in the darkness. "Yeah? Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever Jacob's final plan turns out to be, I want you to know something." "What's that?" "I love you. Not because of the situation we're in, not because you saved me, not because of anything Jacob orchestrated. I love you because of who you choose to be every day, because of the way you look at Hope like she's made of starlight, because you're the kind of man who would die to protect people who have no blood claim on you." Bo felt his throat tighten. With emotion, "I love you too, Mara Lynn, more than I ever thought I could love anything. Then we'll face whatever comes together. As a family." The hours passed slowly, marked by the soft ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece and the gentle sounds of Hope's breathing. Bo found himself thinking about the life they might have after this was over, if they survived. A real wedding, maybe. More children. Growing old together in this cabin or some other place where the past couldn't reach them, but mostly he thought about the weapons cache he'd buried and retrieved, about the man he'd been when he first hid those guns and explosives. That man had been running from everything, his past, his guilt, his fear of what he might become. This man, the one sitting in the darkness waiting for killers to come, was running toward something instead. Toward a future worth fighting for. As dawn approached, bringing with it the promise of violence and the possibility of death, Bo Callahan felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The weapons cache represented more than just tools of violence. It represented the transformation of his past into a weapon for protecting his future. Everything he'd learned during his years as an outlaw, every skill he'd developed in the service of selfish goals, was now dedicated to something larger than himself. Jacob Hartwell was coming, and when he arrived, he would discover that his carefully laid plans had created something he'd never anticipated, a family willing to die for each other, and a man who'd finally found something worth killing for. They came at dawn, just as Jacob's letter had promised, emerging from the morning mist like ghosts made flesh. Bo counted 7 riders spread across the eastern approach to the homestead, moving with the careful coordination of men who'd planned their attack thoroughly. Jacob rode at the center of the group, his familiar silhouette unmistakable even at a distance. From his position at the main window, Bo could see the iron stove that had once bound Mara in helpless terror. Now it served as cover. Its black bulk positioned to protect them from incoming fire while providing a stable rest for his Winchester. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. The instrument of Jacob's cruelty transformed into a tool for their defense. 7 men, he called softly to Mara in the loft above. Jacob plus 6 others. They're spreading out to surround the cabin. "I see them," she replied, her voice steady despite the danger. 2 riders breaking off toward the barn. "Looks like they're trying to cut off our escape routes." Bo had expected as much. Jacob was too experienced to simply charge the cabin and hope for the best. He would want to control the battlefield, eliminate their options, force them into a confrontation where his superior numbers would tell. The riders stopped just outside rifle range, close enough to be clearly visible, but far enough away to avoid immediate engagement. Jacob dismounted and walked his horse forward another 50 yards, still staying beyond the effective range of most weapons, but close enough to be heard. Mara Lynn. His voice carried across the morning air with the false joviality of a man playing. "A role. I've come to take you and our daughter home." "This is our home," Mara called back from the loft, her voice strong and clear. "And Hope and I aren't going anywhere with you." Jacob's laughter was cold and calculating. "I'm afraid that's not one of your choices, my dear. You see, Mr. Callahan is a wanted man, a killer and a fugitive from justice. As a law-abiding citizen, it's my duty to see that he's brought to account for his crimes." Bo could see the game Jacob was playing. By positioning himself as an agent of justice rather than a vengeful husband, he was creating a narrative that would justify whatever violence followed. Anyone investigating afterward would find a story about a dangerous outlaw finally brought to justice, not a man murdering his wife and child. "What about Bill Morrison?" Bo called out. "You going to bring yourself to account for that killing?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Jacob replied smoothly. "Bill Morrison was killed by a wanted outlaw who's been terrorizing this territory for weeks. The same outlaw who's now holding my wife and child hostage." It was smoothly done, and Bo had to admire the thoroughness of Jacob's planning. Every angle had been considered, every eventuality prepared for. But Jacob had made one crucial error. He'd underestimated what desperate people were capable of when they had nothing left to lose. "Last chance, Callahan," Jacob called. "Come, out with your hands up, let my family go, and maybe we can settle this without anyone getting hurt." Instead of answering, Bo sighted carefully through the Winchester's scope and put a bullet into the ground, 6 inches from Jacob's feet. The sound of the shot echoed across the valley like thunder, and Jacob's horse shied nervously at the sudden noise. "That's close enough," Bo called back. "Next one won't be a warning." Jacob retreated to a safer distance, and Bo could see him gesturing to his men. The coordinated attack was about to begin. The first shots came from 3 directions simultaneously. The barn, a grove of trees to the north, and a rocky outcropping that commanded the western approach. Bullets shattered the cabin's windows and thudded into the heavy log walls, sending splinters flying through the air. Bo had positioned himself behind the iron stove for exactly this reason. The cast iron was thick enough to stop rifle bullets, and its position gave him a clear field of fire toward the main approaches. He returned fire methodically, not trying for quick kills, but forcing the attackers to keep their heads down and limiting their movement. From the loft, Mara's derringer cracked sharply, and Bo heard one of the attackers cry out in pain. The small gun wasn't accurate at long range, but it was perfect for covering the cabin's blind spots and keeping enemies from getting too close. "One down!" Mara called. "Hit the man by the barn!" The battle settled into a rhythm of attack and counterattack, with Jacob's men trying to close the distance, while Bo and Mara kept them pinned down with accurate fire. But Bo could see the fundamental problem they faced. They were outnumbered and running low on ammunition. Jacob could afford to trade bullets. They couldn't. After 20 minutes of steady gunfire, a new threat emerged. Smoke began rising from the barn, and Bo realized that Jacob's men had set it ablaze. The wind was blowing toward the cabin, and if the fire spread, they would be forced out into the open. "They're trying to burn us out," he called to Mara. "I see it. We need to fall." Back to the secondary position they had planned for this contingency. Behind the cabin, a natural depression in the ground provided cover while giving them a clear view of all approaches. More importantly, it was where Bo had positioned his trump card, the dynamite that could level the playing field if used correctly. "Go," Bo told Mara. "Take Hope and get to the rocks. I'll cover you." The next few minutes were the longest of Bo's life. Mara climbed down from the loft with Hope clutched tightly against her chest, moving with the quick efficiency of a mother protecting her child. Bo laid down covering fire as she slipped out the back door and ran for the rocky outcropping behind the cabin. Just as she reached safety, the cabin's roof caught fire. Jakob's men had used burning arrows, and the dry wood went up like kindling. Within minutes, the structure that had been their home was becoming a blazing inferno. But the fire worked both ways. The smoke provided cover as Bo made his own retreat, carrying his weapons and the precious dynamite. Jakob's men, thinking they had won, moved closer to the burning cabin, exactly as Bo had hoped they would. Now, he called to Mara as he reached the rocks. She opened fire from her new position, forcing the attackers to take cover behind whatever they could find. In the confusion, Bo was able to work his way around to a flanking position where he had a clear view of the bridge across the creek, the main route Jakob's men would use to reach their position. The first stick of dynamite went off with a roar that shook the ground and sent a geyser of dirt and water high into the air. The bridge disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris, cutting off the primary approach to their position. The second explosion brought down the old oak tree that commanded the eastern approach, creating a barrier that would force any attackers to expose themselves to reach the rocks. Jakob's men were shouting now, confused and disoriented by the sudden turn of events. They had expected to face a desperate outlaw and a frightened woman, not a coordinated defense with military precision. "Jakob!" Bo called out, his voice carrying over the sound of crackling flames and settling debris. "This isn't going the way you planned, is it?" "You're only delaying the inevitable," Jacob shouted back, but Bo could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "There's nowhere left to run!" "Who's running?" Mara called from her position among the rocks. "We're right here!" The third explosion took out a section of the barn that Jakob's men had been using for cover, forcing them back into the open. Bo picked off one of them with a careful shot from the Winchester, the bullet finding its mark at nearly 200 yards. But even as they held their own in the firefight, Bo knew they couldn't maintain this position indefinitely. Jakob still had more men, more ammunition, and the advantage of time. Eventually, their defenses would be overwhelmed unless something changed the dynamic of the battle. That something came in the form of dust clouds on the horizon, riders approaching. From the south, at full gallop. For a moment Bo's heart sank, thinking Jacob had reinforcements arriving. But as the riders drew closer, he recognized the lead horse and felt a surge of hope. Samuel Garrett was riding toward the homestead with at least a dozen men behind him, all of them armed and moving with purpose. The cavalry had arrived, but the battle was far from over. Jakob's men had seen the approaching riders too, and they were repositioning for a final desperate assault on the rocks where Bo, Mara, and Hope had taken refuge. The iron stove sat in the ruins of the burning cabin, its black surface barely visible through the smoke and flames. But Bo could see it clearly in his mind, the symbol of everything Jakob represented, everything they were fighting against. Soon, very soon, this would all be over one way or another. The arrival of Samuel Garrett and his men changed everything, but not in the way Bo had hoped. Instead of retreating or surrendering, Jakob made a desperate gambit that caught everyone off guard. As Garrett's riders approached from the south, Jakob broke cover and sprinted toward the rocky outcropping where Mara and Hope were hidden, a knife gleaming in his hand. "If I can't have them, nobody can!" he screamed, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking to reveal the madness beneath. Bo's Winchester cracked, but Jacob was moving too fast, zigzagging between the rocks with the desperate agility of a man who had nothing left to lose. The bullet meant for Jacob's chest instead shattered against stone, sending sharp fragments flying through the air. Mara saw him coming and raised her derringer, but Hope chose that moment to cry out in fear. At the sound of gunfire, and the tiny distraction was enough to throw off her aim. Jacob leaped the last few feet to reach her position, his knife raised high and his face twisted with murderous intent. The blade that stopped him wasn't Bo's or Mara's. It was Jacob's own knife, turned against him in a moment of desperate struggle. Mara had dropped the derringer and grabbed Jacob's wrist as he lunged, using his own momentum to drive the blade upward and into his chest. For a moment, they were frozen in a grotesque tableau, husband and wife locked in a final deadly embrace while their daughter cried between them. "You were always stronger than I gave you credit for," Jacob whispered, his voice already growing weak as blood bubbled from his lips. "I should have killed you properly the first time." "Yes," Mara said quietly, her hands steady as she held the knife in place. "You should have." Jacob's eyes went wide with shock, not at the wound, but at the cold certainty in his wife's voice. He'd expected tears, fear, maybe even remorse. Instead, he found only the implacable justice of a woman who'd been pushed too far. "The money," he gasped, his hand clutching weakly at her dress. "The Denver job. It's hidden in the old mine shaft north of town. Take it. Take hope. Start over." His final words were lost in a cough that brought up more blood. Jacob Hartwell died, with his eyes open, staring up at the Wyoming sky that had witnessed his crimes and his final defeat. Mara sat back on her heels, the bloody knife still in her hand, and looked down at the man who had terrorized her for 3 years. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, only the exhausted relief of someone who'd finally escaped a nightmare that had lasted far too long. "It's over," she said softly, reaching for hope with her free hand. "It's finally over." The remaining members of Jacob's gang, seeing their leader dead and facing Garrett's approaching riders, threw down their weapons and called for quarter. The fight had gone out of them with Jacob's death, leaving them nothing but hired guns, with no one left to pay them. Bo reached Mara's position just as Samuel Garrett and his men surrounded the homestead. The older rancher took in the scene, the burning cabin, the scattered bodies of Jacob's men, the woman holding her baby while sitting beside her dead husband, and nodded with grim satisfaction. "Justice has been served," Garrett said simply. "About time someone put that mad dog down, Mara." Bo knelt beside her, gently taking the knife from her trembling fingers. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, but he could see the shock setting in. Killing a man, even one who deserved it, left marks on a person's soul, even when it was justified, even when it was necessary. Taking a life changed you in ways that couldn't be undone. "I had to," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was going to kill hope. He was going to kill all of us." "I know," Bo said, pulling her and the baby against his chest. "You did what needed doing. You protected our daughter." The word "our" seemed to anchor her, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this anymore. Hope had stopped crying and was looking up at them with the wide, curious eyes of a child, too young to understand violence, but old enough to sense when the danger had passed. Samuel Garrett organized his men to secure the area and tend to the wounded, but his attention kept returning to the family, huddled among the rocks. He'd known Mara Lynn since she was a girl, had watched her marry Jacob against her father's wishes, had suspected for years that things weren't right at the isolated homestead. Now, seeing her hold her child while sitting beside her husband's body, he felt a complex mixture of sadness and relief. "What happens now?" one of his men asked, gesturing toward the bodies scattered around the homestead. "Now we clean up this mess and tell the truth," Garrett replied. "Jacob Hartwell tried to murder his wife and child. When that failed, he came back with hired guns to finish the job. They met with the justice they deserved. What about Callahan? There's still a warrant out on him." Garrett considered this for a moment, then walked over to where Bo was comforting Mara and Hope. "Mr. Callahan, I believe you have something that belongs to the territory." Bo looked up, confused, until Garrett held out his hand expectantly. After a moment's hesitation, Bo reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled wanted poster that had made him a fugitive. Garrett took the poster, studied it for a moment, then methodically tore it into small pieces that he scattered to. "The wind. What warrant?" he said with a slight smile. Far as I can see, you're just a man who helped defend a woman and child from a gang of murderers. Territory needs more men like that, not fewer. It was irregularly done, but the frontier had its own way of handling justice. Samuel Garrett was respected enough that his word would carry weight with the territorial authorities, and there were enough witnesses to Jacob's crimes to make the official story believable. The money Jacob mentioned, Mara said, looking up. From Hope. The proceeds from their robberies, if it's really hidden in that mine shaft. Blood money, Garrett said firmly. Best thing would be to return it to whoever it was stolen from, make some restitution for the harm that's been done. And if we can't find the original owners, then it goes to good causes. Schools, churches, maybe a fund for widows and orphans. Turn something evil into something that might do some good in the world. As the sun climbed higher over the Wyoming Territory, the immediate aftermath of the battle was resolved with frontier efficiency. Bodies were loaded onto wagons, wounded men were tended to, and statements were taken from all the participants. The story that emerged was simple and believable. A violent criminal had threatened innocent lives and met with appropriate justice. But for Bo, Mara, and Hope, the real aftermath was just beginning. They had survived Jacob's final gambit, but they had also lost the only home Hope had ever known. The cabin lay in ruins, everything they owned reduced to ashes and memories. "What do we do now?" Mara asked, as they watched Garrett's men prepare to leave. "Where do we go?" Bo looked around at the devastation. The burned cabin, the shattered bridge, the scarred earth where their brief happiness had taken root. Then he looked at the woman holding their daughter, and suddenly the answer was clear. "We build something new," he said simply. "Maybe here, maybe somewhere else, but we build it together, and we build it to last." Jacob's knife lay forgotten in the dirt beside his body, its blade still stained with his blood. But it was no longer a weapon of terror and control. It had become an instrument of justice, wielded by a woman who had finally found the strength to fight back. The nightmare was over. The future, whatever it might hold, belonged to them. 6 months later, the photographer from Cedar Falls positioned his camera carefully on its wooden tripod, adjusting the focus with the meticulous attention of an artist capturing something precious. The autumn light streaming through the windows of Samuel Garrett's ranch house was perfect for portraiture, soft and golden, with just enough warmth to bring out the happiness in his subjects' faces. "Hold still now," the photographer instructed gently. "This will just take a moment." Bo sat in the chair beside the window, his arm around Mara's waist as she stood beside him with Hope, cradled in her arms. The baby was 8 months old now, with dark hair like her mother's, and eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with bright curiosity. She wore a new dress that Mara had sewn from fabric purchased with honest money earned from teaching school in Cedar Falls, and her parents were dressed in clothes that spoke of respectability and hope. The photograph they were having taken would serve multiple purposes. It would document their family for posterity, provide evidence of their new life together for any legal questions that might arise, and most importantly, it would replace the wanted poster that had once defined Bo's existence with something that showed who he truly was: a husband, a father, a man who had found his place in the world. "Perfect," the photographer said, as the flash powder ignited with a bright flare. "That should make a beautiful portrait." As they waited for the photographer to pack his equipment, Bo reflected on how much had changed since that terrible night when Jacob had come calling with murder in his heart. The burned homestead had been rebuilt, this time with help from the community and resources that came from an unexpected source, the money Jacob had mentioned in his dying words. True to Samuel Garrett's suggestion, they had located the cache of stolen money in the abandoned mine shaft and worked diligently to return it to its rightful owners. What couldn't be returned, proceeds from robberies too old to trace or victims who couldn't be located, had been donated to establish a school, fund for the territory's children. The irony wasn't lost on any of them that Jacob's crimes had ultimately contributed to the education of future generations. Mrs. Callahan, the photographer's use of Mara's married name still brought a smile to her face. They had been properly wed 3 months ago in the Cedar Falls church, with Samuel Garrett standing as Beau's best man and half the town in attendance. It had been a simple ceremony, but meaningful in ways that went far beyond the legal formalities. "Yes," she replied, adjusting Hope's position as the baby began to fuss slightly. "Would you like me to take another photograph? Perhaps one of just the three of you in a more casual pose?" They agreed, and this time they arranged themselves more naturally, Beau standing behind Mara's chair with his hands on her shoulders, Hope sitting on her mother's lap and reaching toward the camera with chubby fingers. This photograph would capture not just their appearance but their ease with each other, the comfortable intimacy of a family that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. After the photographer left, they sat on the porch of their new home and watched the sun set over the valley where they had fought for their right to exist. The house was larger than the cabin they had lost, built with permanence in mind and positioned to command a view of all approaches. Old habits died hard for a man who had lived by his wits and his gun, but the defensive positioning was balanced by touches that spoke of peace. Flower boxes in the windows, a garden plot where Mara grew vegetables and herbs, a swing that Beau had built for Hope to use when she was old enough. "Do you ever regret it?" Mara asked as she nursed Hope in the fading light. "Giving up the freedom to move on whenever you wanted? Settling down with all the responsibilities that come with a family?" Beau considered the question seriously. The old life had been simpler in some ways. No one depending on him, no ties to bind him to any particular place, no need to consider anyone's welfare but his own. But it had also been empty. A series of days strung together without meaning or purpose. "Never," he said finally. "Freedom without something worth being free for isn't really freedom at all. It's just existing. And this? What would you call this?" He looked at his wife and daughter, at the home they had built together, at the community that had accepted them despite their unconventional beginning. "This is living," he said simply. "This is having something worth protecting." As if sensing the importance of the moment, Hope finished nursing and looked up at her parents with the kind of perfect contentment that only babies could achieve. She was too young to understand the violence that had preceded her birth or the struggles that had followed, but she would grow up knowing that she was wanted, protected, and loved beyond measure. "Samuel stopped by the school today," Mara said, settling Hope against her shoulder to burp her. "He said the territorial governor is considering establishing a formal law enforcement presence in this part of Wyoming. Asked if you might be interested in applying for the position of deputy marshal." The suggestion wasn't entirely surprising. Beau's actions during the confrontation with Jacob had earned him a reputation as a man who could handle dangerous situations with intelligence and restraint. His knowledge of criminal behavior, gained from years on the wrong side of the law, would be valuable in enforcing legitimate justice. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think," Mara said carefully, "that some men are meant to build things, and others are meant to protect what's been built. You've proven you can do both." It was an attractive prospect, the chance to use his skills in service of something larger than himself, to be part of the growing civilization that was slowly taming the frontier. But it would also mean danger, long absences from home, and the constant possibility that he might not return from some confrontation with desperados or outlaws. "We don't have to decide tonight," Mara said, reading his thoughts. "But I want you to know that whatever you choose, Hope and I will support you. You've already proven that you're the kind of man who stands up for what's right, regardless of the cost." As night fell over their valley, they moved inside and prepared for the evening routines that had become precious in their ordinariness. Hope's bath and bedtime story, the cleaning of dishes from their simple supper, the checking of doors and windows that was as much habit as security. Later, as they lay in their bed listening to Hope's soft breathing from her cradle nearby, Bo thought about the photograph they had taken that day. It would join the few other pictures they possessed. One of Mara's parents from before the war, a formal portrait of Samuel Garrett that he had given them as a housewarming gift, and now this image of their family at the beginning of what they hoped would be a long and peaceful life together. Bo? Mara's voice was soft in the darkness. Yeah? Do you think Hope will ask about her father someday? Her real father, I mean. It was a question they had discussed before, but one that would become more pressing as Hope grew older and began to understand the complexities of adult relationships. She might, Bo said honestly. And when she does, we'll tell her the truth, that Jacob Hartwell was the man who gave her life, but that you and I are the ones who chose to build her a life worth living. And if she wants to know more about what he was like, what happened to him, then we'll tell her that too, all of it, the good and the bad, the choices he made and the consequences that followed. She has a right to know her history, even the parts that are painful. Mara was quiet for a moment, and Bo could feel her thinking through the implications. I want her to understand that people can change, she said finally, that mistakes don't have to define you forever, and that it's never too late to choose a different path, like us. Outside their window, the Wyoming night was vast and peaceful, filled with the sound of wind through the pine trees and the distant call of owls hunting in the darkness. It was the same landscape where they had fought for their lives just months ago, but now it felt like home in a way that neither of them had experienced before. The family portrait they had taken that day would eventually hang in the parlor of their house, a testament to their survival and their love. But more than that, it would serve as a reminder of what was possible when people refused to accept the roles that others tried to force upon them, when a victim became a survivor, when an outlaw became a protector, when strangers became a family. In the morning, there would be decisions to make about the future, work to be done on the ranch, lessons to teach at the school. But tonight, they were simply three people who had found each other against impossible odds and chosen to build something beautiful from the wreckage of their past. Hope stirred in her cradle, making the soft sounds that meant she was dreaming, and both her parents smiled in the darkness. Whatever those dreams contained, they would be free of the violence and fear that had marked her earliest days. She would grow up knowing security, love, and the certainty that she was cherished beyond measure. And that, Bo reflected, as sleep began to claim him, was perhaps the greatest victory of all. Not just that they had survived Jacob's evil, but that they had transformed it into something good, something lasting, something worthy of the sacrifices that had been made to protect it. The photograph would capture their faces, but the real picture of their family was written in smaller moments, in shared laughter and gentle touches, in the daily choices to love and protect and build together. It was a picture that would continue to develop for years to come, adding new chapters to a story that had begun with desperation and violence but had found its way to hope. In Cedar Falls, the photographer developed their portrait with care, knowing that he was preserving more than just an image. He was documenting the transformation of three lives, the birth of a family, and the triumph of love over cruelty. When he finished, the photograph showed exactly what it was meant to show: a man, a woman, and a child who had chosen each other, and would spend the rest of their lives proving that choice was the right one. The picture was perfect.